Now, back here in the U.S., Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a legislation on Wednesday that would set interest rates on subsidized Stafford student loans at the same rate as big banks. Here are her remarks on the Senate floor about the Bank on Student Loan Fairness Act.
In other words, the federal government is going to charge interest rates 9 times higher than the rates they charge the biggest banks, the same banks that destroyed millions of jobs and nearly broke the economy. That isn't right.
Now, without this or similar legislation, student interest rates will double to 6.8% in July. Right now, banks borrow money at an interest rate of just 0.75%. However, this bill is only a temporary measure. These lower interest rates would only be effective for 1 year, just long enough for Congress to debate long-term legislation. For more on the state of our education system, both here in the United States as well as abroad, I'm joined here in D.C. by Professor Patricio Zamorano, a political analyst and editor of InfoAmericas.info, and in our L.A. studio, Natalia Abrams, co-founder and director of operations at Student Debt Crisis. Natalia, I'll start with you. The effects of this bill could be very far-reaching, but again, it's only for 1 year. So let's talk about how this bill would affect, in particular, future generations of students entering college and also the ones that are that have already exited college.
Right. So the doubling of the student loan rate to 6.8% is going to affect all new students coming in. They did this last year. It feels like we just do 1 year fixes and it doesn't do enough. So every year, instead of fighting for newer legislation, organizations such as ours, studentdebtcrisis.org, has to go back and fight what we fought last year. So what Elizabeth Warren's bill will do will allow us to, like you said, borrow at the same rates that the banks are borrowing at. I mean, right now, students are borrowing at 9 times higher, especially if the interest rate goes up. But unfortunately, what Elizabeth Warren's bill does not do is help existing borrowers, and that's where our bill, H.R. 1330, that Representative Karen Bass introduced, will actually help existing borrowers with the Student Loan Fairness Act.
And Natalia, as you had mentioned, it's only for 1 year in order to give Congress more time to be able to figure out what's being done and what needs to be done in the future. But what is the point of 1 year or a couple of months? What is that realistically going to do in terms of the negotiations? They've been going on for quite some time, after all.
Right. Well, I feel like it's a distraction technique that, like I said before, that we have to fight for this year after year versus doing something that will fundamentally change the way we borrow and provide funding for education in the United States. I mean, this is getting completely out of hand, and we need something truly comprehensive like our bill that will allow students to be forgiven for a partial amount of their debt. And after 10 years, it's a 10-10 program, and we truly believe that our bill both hits existing borrowers and new borrowers coming in. And we need that type of comprehensive legislation to really go forward. As Elizabeth Warren said, we need to value education in this country. It's vital to our national security to have an educated society, and we are telling students that it's more important to buy a car or to buy a house when you look at interest rates than it is to go to school. And we're sending this consumerist message to our students that I think is very wrong and very harmful to our country as a whole.
Now, Patricio, what we have in the U.S. obviously is Senator Warren and others who are fighting to come up with some type of solutions. Now, as I understand it, that's not necessarily the case in Chile. It's these huge, massive student movements like the one on April 11th where over 150,000 students gathered. So talk about what's going on in Chile right now.
Well, what's going on there is not necessarily only in terms of coverage. Actually, the main issue there is access, but quality of education. In fact, the middle class now is able to go to college. That's a common thing now. We have scholarships, etc. The students, of course, are complaining about the fact that the education system in Chile is based on private companies, and they are basically considering education as a company, as a for-profit entity. So what they're finding now is to have free education, real free public education, but at the same time, not only that, that public education has enough quality to actually to respond to the expectations of middle class that actually is eager to develop, to have a better salary, to have a better life. So that's the main issue right now in Chile.
So you're talking about raising the public education standards to be able to compete with private education. Natalia, we're dealing with private education loans in the United States as well. Can you talk about private education loans and how that might be factoring into the student debt crisis right here?
Well, with private education loans, most of them are unsubsidized student loans and private loans, and they can't be converted to federal. They're not eligible for a lot of the federal programs that are actually out there right now that provide a little relief. So, and not to mention you're paying so much more. But the funny thing is, for some middle class and lower class students, lower income students, they actually sometimes can get a better loan deal, a better deal by going to a private school because there's more aid available for them. But that private student loan debt is really crushing when we see tuition at $50,000, $60,000 a year. I mean, students are taking out over $200,000 to attend these private schools, which is more than the average mortgage in this country. So I think the private student loan is a really big part of it. And then the for-profit student loans of the private schools, that's where we're really hurting students, because at least with some of the private schools, there's some good education there. You're going to get a good education if you go to Harvard or Yale. I mean, you're going to have to pay for it. But if you go to the University of Phoenix or DeVry, you're going to pay the same prices as Harvard, roughly, and you're not getting the same type of education at all. And that's where we're really seeing a lot of students get in trouble, is by going to these schools that they think are good, our federal government accredits them, and they're not getting jobs because they're not really considered good schools out there in the workplace.
Meanwhile, Patricio, people in the United States are using these private schooling kind of systems in order to be able to go around some of the public school systems. But at the same time, let's talk about what's going on in Chile in terms of financial aid. As I understand it, they recently raised the minimum wage requirements for students, and it's actually leaving a huge gap in the students and how they're able to fund their education. And a lot of them aren't, because they're not receiving these loans. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, just to have a better idea, like in a public university, actually one of the best universities in Chile, maybe the best one, Universidad de Chile, Chilean university, right, which is the oldest public one, you have to pay a year maybe around $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, which is not a big amount if we compare that with the United States, but it's exactly $4,000 is the minimum salary for 1 year for any family, which is, if we calculate that in terms of the impact for the quality of life of those families, you basically you choose between eating or studying, and that's a big issue in Chile. The other position, though, we have two positions in Chile, basically. One position said that public education should be free for everyone across the board, free. That's what the movement is actually fighting for. The other position, for example, former President Bachelet, who is running again this year, she is saying rich families, wealthy families should pay. Otherwise, we are subsidizing the rich. So those are the two basic positions that we have in Chile. Personally, I think that we should have a system where wealthy families should pay more, of course, and poor family with very skilled students, they shouldn't pay a dime, basically.
Sure. Natalia, I do want to put a quick chart up on the board that I think speaks volumes about the state of American education today. So that white line right there, this is based on the 17% raises in annual rates of student debt in the U.S. Right now, student debt is second only to mortgage debt in the United States. So as you can see, we've already surpassed credit card debt. We've already surpassed the total GDP of Australia. And we have a possibility of surpassing many countries' GDPs with our student debt alone. So talk about this for me. Why is this issue not more seriously debated in the United States at this moment?
Wow. You know, if I wish I had that perfect answer, but I completely agree. Why aren't we talking about this? This is almost as large as the mortgage crisis. It's, as you said, larger than credit card debt. I've seen projections in, the next 20 years of reaching, 10, 15 trillion, actually surpassing what our GDP is now in the next 15 to 20 years. We have to talk about this. Dr. Susan Rice, our UN secretary, said that this is vital to our national security. So until we take care of this student loan crisis, I don't see our country getting back on its feet. We have to have students that can graduate with little to no debt and go into jobs where they actually can see rising salaries. This is something that is vital, as I said before, to our national security, to just our way of life. We need to impress that education is important. And this is kind of our form of austerity going on in the U.S. right now, and that's how we connect with Chile.
It's a debate that is going on, and it's going to have to continue in the future. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Patricio Zamorano is a political analyst and editor of InfoAmericas.info, and Natalia Abrams, co-founder of Director of Operations at Student Debt Crisis. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.